Welcome back to another episode of 5 a.m. Theology. So, Chris, this week we're at arguably the most difficult passages in the Bible to read. And I don't mean difficult, hard to understand. I mean difficult in emotionally hard to digest. This week we get to the Passion passages. Since we only have a short time together, I just want to zoom in on one particular passage, which is found in all four Gospels, and that's Jesus's arrest. Because I think in our emotions, when we're reading these passages, sometimes we can skip over things and miss things.
Definitely. And sometimes that's with the most familiar things that we do that with. Like you said, this narrative is found in all four Gospels. They all go out in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus goes off and prays to his Father. And right after that, Judas and some Roman soldiers show up and they arrest Jesus.
And I'll read from Matthew's account, but all four Gospels have pretty much exactly the same wording, although John adds some additional details. But Matthew 26:47-52 says, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man, seize him. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, greetings, Rabbi, and he kissed him. Jesus said to him, friend, do what you came to do. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. So, Chris, in this passage, there are four groups involved in the arrest of Jesus. And all four, although very different, all four miss an important truth about Jesus. And I think everyone falls into one of these four groups.
Yeah, the first and the most obvious, who's an individual, not a group, is Judas. Judas's involvement is curious because, as Jesus says in John's account, he had been teaching and preaching out in the open. They could have arrested him at any time, yet they come skulking in the dark and they use Judas to point out which man Jesus was. So why did Judas betray Jesus? Out of all four groups of people who get it wrong, Judas is the one who is a study in the stark contrast between those who belong to God and those who don't.
Yeah, you're right. We learned from earlier readings that Judas loved money and was even helping himself to the apostles' till. He had heard Jesus preach. He sat under Jesus's private teachings that were just for the disciples. He'd witnessed Jesus performing miracles, and he'd even seen Jesus give the apostles authority to perform exorcisms. Now, we don't know if Judas himself had ever performed an exorcism or not, but it has to completely blow your mind as to how someone who was that close to physical Jesus could betray him. And the answer is because he was so steeped in wickedness, in his idolatry and his sin. Judas's love of money over everything else is what drove him to steal the money that Jesus and the apostles had in their till, which they used to help the poor. And Judas's love of money over everything else is what drove him up to offer up the Son of God to the Pharisees for a price. Judas betrays Jesus for money, thinking it's going to bring him a better life. He failed to see that Jesus was the only way to real life. Far from a better life, rejecting Jesus brought death, physical and spiritual death for Judas.
In today's terms, those who would probably identify with Judas would be the ones who vehemently opposed Jesus. They're openly hostile, openly mocking towards him. And the most obvious would be the Church of Satan or satanic cults. I looked up their beliefs, and you might find this kind of interesting. They self-describe themselves as far left progressives who are willing to protect abortion, same-sex marriage, and transgenderism at all costs. And they say that they say we need to fight the dominance of Christianity in our society and declare total autonomy over our minds and bodies. and reject any authority that tells us otherwise.
Yeah. And the Church of Satan goes by other names like Islam. Chris, just a few weeks ago, a group of Muslims called for a day of jihad. That was a day where Muslims were to rise up and kill non Muslims, but especially to kill Christians. And of course, Islam's not alone, being another name for satanic cults. There's other groups that fit in the Judas profile, but you get the idea.
Yeah, definitely. And another group that's present at Gethsemane that failed to see Jesus correctly was the Roman soldiers. The Roman military was highly disciplined and well trained and heavily armed. They are told by their superiors, who are appeasing the Jewish leaders and the elders, that there was a troublemaker who was threatening the peace of Rome. The Roman Empire was known for their policy of Pax Romana, which was peace in the empire. The Roman leadership was willing to tolerate different religions, even Judaism, as long as nobody disturbed the peace. So these guys are told that there's a guy who's threatening the peace of our great nation. So go arrest him and bring him in. And that's exactly what they went to Gethsemane to do, even though John's account tells us that they were a little afraid of Jesus. Well, maybe they'd seen some of his miracles and were wondering if he was going to do something supernatural to them. But still, despite whatever fear or awe that they might have had of Jesus, they still do it. They still arrest him. They thought they were ridding Rome of one man who was threatening their peace. And what they failed to see was that Jesus was the only man who could really bring them true peace.
Yeah. Today, that would be people who aren't vehemently opposed to Jesus. They're not like the satanic cults in Islam, but they just want to live their lives as they want to. They like their quote unquote peace, and they don't want Jesus coming in upsetting things. And since the real Jesus would totally upset that mold, they either ignore him completely or change him to make him more palpable. They like their peaceful lives, quote unquote, and they don't want Jesus upsetting things. There's a ton of people in this group. In fact, I would say this category was probably what the majority of people in the world fall into.
Yeah, without a doubt. Some may even claim that they're Christian. You got New Agers, you got Buddhists, yogis, these enlightened scholars, the plural relativists, and those whose Jesus would never do or say anything that's not nice. And those are just naming a few groups. Just as an example, Alita Reynolds, who was president of Women of Faith, which is a women's Christian organization, posted this. And I'm going to quote her. Our life is built on building blocks. The foundational block of our entire life is you and God and nothing else. Everything else is built from this. This is the solid foundation we can rest on. And that's the end of the quote. Is God being the only authority and foundation in your life messing with your peace? Well, just add yourself in there as a co-partner. In fact, list yourself first.
Yeah. And like you said with the others, we could go on, but you get the idea. So the next group of the four were the Jewish leaders and elders. And most of them were not actually present at Jesus's arrest, but they were the catalyst for it. All four gospels record that they armed the men who were there with swords and clubs. You can imagine them telling the Roman governor, "We want this rebel Jesus dead or alive." They rightly saw Jesus as a threat to their way of life. He was. But they loved the prestige, the honor, and the status that they had, and they weren't willing to give it up. They were false teachers for sure, but they didn't think they were. They actually believed God chose them as the leaders of the Jewish people, and they used that belief to justify their evil behavior. They thought getting rid of Jesus would not only preserve their way of life, but they thought they were doing a service to God by getting rid of him. The high priest Caiaphas had prophesied earlier before this happens. He says, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it's better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." That's found in John 11.
Yeah, I love this. God gives Caiaphas a true prophecy, but he and the rest of the Jewish leaders completely misunderstand it. They don't even get it. They take it to mean it's better to kill Jesus than to have the Roman leadership come down on the Jews because Jesus is rousing people up and disturbing the peace. They thought they were preserving the law of God and the covenant God had made with them by getting rid of Jesus. And the Pharisees and the other Jewish leaders failed to see that far from destroying the law and God's covenant, Jesus was there to fulfill it.
And of course, this today translates to church leaders and teachers who may think they're doing a service to God, or maybe they're not even worried about that. Maybe they just like the honor and the prestige and the wealth that comes with their position. But the reality is they're leading people astray and they're teaching lies straight from hell about Jesus. And Chris, first one that comes to mind is the Catholic Church. And I'm sorry if that offends anyone, but how else can you describe an organization that says it's Christian, yet they worship a man, the Pope, as equal to God, and they disregard biblical teachings in favor of what some men have said that God has told them?
That's the first one that came to my mind too. And just so no one thinks that we're picking on the Catholics alone, you can throw in a slew of Protestant churches and teachers and leaders that claim to teach the truth. And again, their teaching is straight from hell. Bill Johnson, Kenneth and Gloria Copeland, Jesse Duplantis, Joyce Meyer, Beth Moore, Joel and Victoria Osteen, Creflo Dollar, and so many others. In fact, his name, Rose, kind of speaks the truth.
Yeah.
How fitting that his last name's Dollar.
Yeah.
And you have to throw the entire denominations in there, like the Methodists and the Lutheran churches. And we've already talked about them so many times. But, I'll give a recent example. Chris Valaton, who's a senior pastor at Bethel Church, said that he has seen thousands of women restored to virginity. How does he know that? That's what I want to know. He's not saying that they've had their sexual sin forgiven. That's not what he's saying. That's not the type of healing he's talking about here. He claims that he has seen God physically restore their hymen.
Chris, what a weird lie, but what a weird thing to teach. He says, women come to me, my hymen's restored. I went to the doctor, my hymen's back intact.
What do you go to the doctor and ask him? Can you check and see if my hymen is back?
I remember learning in 4th grade that riding a bicycle could tear your hymen.
I don't think I learned that in 4th grade, but
whatever. I don't remember when it was. Going back to the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus's arrest, the last group that was there were the apostles. So how did they see Jesus wrongly? Well, it started earlier when Jesus had told them several times that he would be offered up and killed. And they both didn't believe it and they didn't understand it. While they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, they were still looking for him to deliver his people at that time, deliver them from Roman oppression, which makes sense then that when they came to arrest Jesus, Peter took his sword and cut off the ear of one of the men. He was ready for a fight. But when Jesus tells him to put his sword away because all who live by the sword die by the sword, that really threw the apostles off a little bit. And when they saw that Jesus wasn't going to fight and he actually allowed himself to be arrested, they took off. Now, at this time, the apostles thought that abandoning Jesus would preserve their lives. What they didn't fully understand yet was that totally surrendering their lives to Jesus was the only way to really preserve your life.
Yeah, and of course, they do come around fully understanding that after Jesus's resurrection, and they were completely bought in once they received the Holy Spirit. Far from worrying about preserving their physical lives, they all willingly and gladly forfeited their physical lives for Jesus.
And I hope this is the group we all find ourselves fitting into. We love Jesus, we're willing to fight for him, and sometimes he teaches us hard things that are difficult for us to understand, but because of the Holy Spirit and with the help of the Holy Spirit, we can surrender our lives to him, love him, witness about him, and follow him even into death.
And that's a great place to end this morning. Have a blessed morning, everybody.